Well, I won't repeat all the thanks by name, but everyone that Father Loya mentioned has been very helpful in arranging this visit. I'm really glad to be here speaking at Villanova. I gave a talk at the very start of this project. I was starting to work through some of these thoughts, and so I thought I would go back and see what I had said there, and I couldn't get back past the fact that the last time I spoke here at Villanova was 2002. So it shows how long I worked on this book and and how long it took to finish and bring out. So it was published last year, and I suppose a better salesman would have brought books or something, but I'm not a very good salesman, so you're just going to have to make do. You're going to have to make do with the talk. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes and then take questions. And I'm going to go over the major themes of the book and where I think it fits into the historiography on the study of World War I and the Russian Revolution. I think there are two reasons why I thought a book like this might be useful, and they're both indicated in the title. One had to do with the need for an update on major military operations in the war. As I was writing this, the last one had been published in the mid-1970s and suffered from numerous flaws, although several strengths as well, the one by Norman Stone on the Eastern Front. And since the publication of my book, another excellent book, more focused than mine on operational history, was written by David Stone. And so I think with the centennial of the war, we're getting more and more publications on the war that are starting to feed off each other, which I think is terrific. The second and more important reason from my perspective has to do with why the study of the Eastern Front is important, not just for histories of the war, but really for histories of the 20th century as a whole. One of the things I deal with in the introduction is what do we learn from the Eastern Front that we don't know already from the shelves and shelves of books on the Western Front of the war. And the answer that I developed over the course of writing this book was that the key thing that differed from the Eastern Front as opposed to the Western Front had to do with decolonization, that is to say with the end of empire in Eastern Europe. That was the significant difference. If you look at who was fighting on the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of these empires collapsed at the end of the war, and the end of empire in Eastern Europe was a fundamental story of that war. So I wanted to write a book that talked about the end of empire and why I thought that process had occurred and how it occurred. So decolonization, that term is not in principle difficult to understand. It's the term historians use to describe basically any end of empire over the course of the 20th century. It doesn't have to be the unraveling of settler colonies, for instance, any form of empire. When the British leave their entire empire and the wide variety of imperial relations they had, the whole process was called decolonization. But nevertheless, when historians talk about decolonization in the 20th century, they normally focus on the period after World War II, when this process takes place in Africa and Asia. This is the great era of decolonization for most world historians, and certainly for historians of those continents. But if we look at Europe and we ask, when's the era of decolonization in Europe? I think it really has to be here in the period of the First World War. This requires us to look at Europe in a different way, as a continent not just of nation states, but of empires and of colonized spaces, or at least of imperially dominated spaces. This is an unremarkable observation if you come from Poland, but it's maybe not so unremarkable if you come from France or you come from Russia. You might have this image in your head of Europe being already, by the beginning of the 20th century, a land of nation states. But it is not. It is a land of empires, even in the early part of the century. So one quick way to see this going on here. Well, I was going to show you two maps. One of them showed Europe in 1907 and the other in 1924. And if you were to take a look at those two maps, you'd see that you have a lot more states present in 1924. States that were there in 1924 that weren't there in 1907 include Poland, Bulgaria, Albania, Turkey, Czechoslovakia, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Austria, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. You have a whole series of new independent states over the course of just 17 years here that requires some explanation, right? the way that this occasionally gets explained is that it's, well, maybe it's the result of the Treaty of Versailles, that it's just, whoa, here we're on the right track now. All right, so as you can see, you know, the colors that we have mapped in here are relatively, obviously they've put Germany, Austria, Hungary, France in the same color, but it's a limited number of states, and you have this whole proliferation of states. And there's two things to note. You know, as I said, this is something that requires explanation. One of the things that we note is that most of them occur in this band right in here. Right? That band is the Eastern Front of World War I. And so is there a relationship between the war and the creation of these new independent states? The one explanation that people have relied on is, oh, it's just the end of the war. It's Woodrow Wilson and self-determination of nations, and obviously that's what creates these new nation states. I think this overstates Wilson's role in events by a substantial margin, and fails to really engage what's happening on the ground in these states and in these societies. Now, decolonization in Europe doesn't start in 1914. It doesn't start with the beginning of the war. It's a long-term process. It's not as if there were no Polish nationalists or Ukrainian nationalists or independence movements in Finland prior to the war. There were, but they were relatively weak, and on the occasions when they tried to forward their agendas, they had been decisively rebuffed by the imperial states, most notably the Russian Empire in the region. The place where decolonizing movements had had success was in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans. And this is really the heartland of European decolonization prior to 1914. And especially with the role of Serbia over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, playing the role of the new independent state that then is going to inspire other independence movements in the region and be engaged in a larger power struggle, the Balkans are really the place to look. So I begin this book actually in the Balkans with the Balkan Wars. The first Balkan War occurs in 1912, the second in 1913. And I can talk about those some if people have questions about them later. But I really see the war, in fact, the beginning of the war also having something to do with decolonization. Because as many of you know, the shot that starts the war happens in Bosnia by radical Serbian nationalists in this space of intense decolonization. And so what we have occurring even at the outset of the war is that questions of empire and decolonization are prominent. So decolonization led to war in the Balkans in 1912 to 1913. But it was war that led to decolonization in the rest of Eastern Europe between 1914 and 1921. As in the Balkans, as I mentioned before, the forces of decolonization, nationalist movements, independence movements, are present in these areas prior to 1914. So what I call an imperial challenge had been building in these regions over the course of those years. But again, they were not strong enough really to challenge the imperial states in the region. And this became evident even to nationalist leaders themselves. So if you read Polish nationalists and Finnish nationalists in the period between the revolution of 1905 and the outbreak of war, many of them are saying, oh, we're not going to see it in my lifetime. There's no way that we're ever going to be successful. There will, a free Poland is going to be distant in the future. And the only way, many of them say, is if we get lucky enough that the states that oppress us, the big imperial states, go to war with one another. Then and only then will there be an opportunity for us to seek independence in our own right. That, of course, is what happens in 1914, and so part of this goes according to these nationalist dreams. That said, if we ask who it is that leads to independence, what groups forward the cause of independence and create the conditions for independence in this region in 1914 to 1917, it's not these nationalists. It's actually the imperial states themselves who create the conditions for these independence movements to succeed. In order to understand this, I'm going to spend much of the rest of the talk talking about the ways that this occurs. We have to understand that one of the key features, in my mind, the key transformation that has to take place in order for independence to occur is, in fact, yeah, it actually got working again. Thanks. Is that we need to think about national independence not as the fruition of nationalist movements, but primarily as the collapse of an existing state, or at least the weakening of an existing state. So there's a difference between states and nations, and the focus on state power and state capacity is what I think is most important in this period, and it's what I focus on most heavily in the book. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If we ask who it is that grants local nationalist leaders the capacity to govern their own cities in 1914 to 1915, it's not because they went out on the street and said, we want to rule Lublin with Poles and for Poles. The people that do it are actually the Russian imperial officials themselves. This is a map of martial law zones in the empire. So martial law, as you may know, is the replacement of civilian administration with military administration. And so it makes sense for generals. They say, we're going to be fighting a war in these zones. And in the deep rear, we want to control farms and industry in these regions. So we want to control these regions. So we're going to take them under our control. What happens when they take this control is that the former imperial officials that are there, the people that have been hired in St. Petersburg to run these regions, many of them flee. Their jobs are in jeopardy, and in many cases, their lives are in jeopardy. And in any case, their jobs are it's no longer clear what it is they're supposed to be doing. Now, the army is supposed to be running all of this. Well, the army, this is a territory here, this area of martial law, that's larger than the state of Germany. And for the first 3 months of the war, this is being governed by a group of less than a dozen people. So they're not doing anything. They're not controlling anything on the ground, the Civilian Affairs Administration of General Headquarters. So who is it that's running this? This is one of the things I wanted to find out in my research. So I went to these archives to find out, who's actually dealing with running markets and making sure that food quality is safe, who is running fire departments, who's running police departments. And the answer is local nationalists. Because once all of these other power structures fled, the people that actually took control were local notables, and most of those people were local nationalists. Most specifically, for those of you that know a little bit about Eastern European politics in this time period, in Poland, that's being run by Roman Dmowski's Endek party, the right-wing nationalists of the Polish national movement. So within months after the start of the war, local administration throughout this entire Polish zone here is being run by Polish nationalists who have now unified into a central committee, central resident committee. So this is, in the very beginning of the war, we're already seeing the unraveling of the empire, not because of nationalist movements, but because the state is transforming itself. Different people are running it, and they're looking to do different things. Now, this would all be interesting and great if we weren't also seeing, obviously, a huge disaster occurring at the same time. And the disaster took a number of different aspects. Violence, of course, is the key to this. Rampaging armies. These armies are engaging in enormous battles with one another. I could name probably 3 or 4 battles here that that even specialists might not be fully aware of, that if you go through the military history books in them, even the military history deal with them in a paragraph or in a sentence, the casualties of which are greater than the Battle of Gettysburg. There are about 53,000 people that are casualties on both sides in the Battle of Gettysburg. In just one army, in just one campaign in February of 1915, in a battle that, again, gets virtually no notice, about 56,000 people become casualties in just one Russian army. And so these are massive clashes, and this scale of violence has an effect on people living in the front. But it's not just the violence, and it's not just the armies that are sort of rampaging through here that make a difference here. It's also the fact that we have begun to see the state begin to collapse. We have begun to see the state begin to fail. Let me take just one example here of economic administration. The pre-war economy in these zones of Eastern Europe that become the Eastern Front and that are the colonized spaces of Eastern Europe are heavily segmented by ethnicity. That is to say, the ethnicity that you are helps to determine the kind of job that you have. So Slavs are overrepresented in the farming population. Jews are overrepresented in trading and small manufacturing, in part because they're forbidden from owning land in many zones of the empire by the Russian state itself. And ethnic Germans tend to be higher level administrators in industrial concerns and landowners, right? So these are not universal, but these are the ethnic tendencies in the region. In other words, the economy itself is structured ethnically in the Russian Empire. So when the war breaks out, one of the things that the state begins to turn to is a new strategy of ethnopolitics. That is to say, they begin to see allies and traitors as being defined ethnically. So the Russian state says at the beginning of the war, we have to be concerned about all of these Germans. We have to make sure that the Germans don't take over this country. And so they make lists of them. They ask the police to make lists of everybody who's a German citizen or might even have a German surname so that they can be targeted for surveillance or perhaps even deportation. The same things happens with Jews in these areas. And so as they begin to implement these ethnopolitical schemes, like deportation, you start to see not only a human tragedy, but you start to see the disarticulation of the economy. You start to deport all of your merchants. You start to deport all of your factory administrators. And these huge gaps begin to appear in the imperial economy. Now, even if that hadn't happened, the Russian government was going to have a really hard time economically in this war. And they didn't have a whole bunch of economic talent within the military, which again, remember, is the group that's administering this, is the political administration of this region. So you have people that have virtually no idea of economics, launching these ethnic cleansing campaigns and trying to deal with the economy at the same time. And what you get is a complete economic disaster in these zones. Again, let me just take one example from the book. One of the things that people want to do in the midst of the war is to take their stuff when a foreign army is coming and get it out of that army's way. So you get people in these border zones that are sugar manufacturers, right? And they will take their stores of sugar and move them to Warsaw. They'll get warehouse space and they'll start selling sugar to citizens in Warsaw. Well, when the Russian army officials look at this and they see these warehouses of sugar, what they think is, these people must be speculators. They're holding on to all of this sugar so that when things go bad, they can sell it to us for a higher price. So these people are really spies. They're really aliens, and we need to arrest them. So you start to get these people arrested for doing very basic economic things. And already within like 3 weeks of the war, Polish businessmen, and the Poles were relatively well treated because you needed to have some ethnic ally in the region, and the Russians were looking to the Poles for this. Polish businessmen are saying, our only option, if you pursue these policies, is liquidation. That is to say, to get rid of all your stuff, transform it into cash, and then you flee, right? You go somewhere else where you can try to survive, right? So what ends up happening is the mass collapse of all of these businesses, and with the increase in demand that we see, because you have all these armies now and all these soldier mouths to feed, and the reduction of supply, right, we start to see prices rise. And the response of the state to price rising is, oh, they're trying to trick us again. All these dang merchants are trying to trick us. So we have to put in price controls, right? You can't sell sugar for more than 75 kopecks a pound. You can't sell meat for more than 3 rubles a pound or whatever. And all of these lists are posted in cities all over the martial law zone, and as I'll talk later, soon all over the empire. Price controls are not a good way to deal with inflation, because what ends up happening is people are going to withhold their goods from the market, or they're going to sell it on the black market, or they're just going to try to avoid the police altogether. And so you end up with even more privation, even more anarchy, and indeed even more inflation than you had at the beginning. And that's what begins to unfold already here in the winter of 1914 and 1915. By 1916, inflation is the #1 issue politically throughout the entire Russian Empire. You can't understand Russia at war, or indeed the Russian Revolution, without understanding how big of a problem inflation was seen to be by people in the home front and indeed in the government. So already, a core state function, regulation of the economy, has collapsed. Right? So we're starting to see state failure as a key moment in what's happening in this war zone very early in the war. This only gets worse with military defeat. The first year of the war had been kind of a mixed bag for the Russian army. In East Prussia, that suffered quite a devastating loss, the loss of the Second Army in an encirclement in the so-called Battle of Tannenberg, but a significant amount of success in Ukraine, in Galicia, in eastern Galicia, where they defeat the Austro-Hungarian army, they push to the peaks of the Carpathians, and they're poised as the winter ends. They're planning a campaign, actually, to go down. They're at the tops of the mountains. They want to go down these mountains into the plains of Hungary to take Budapest and knock Austria-Hungary out of the war. And they're on the verge, really, of doing this. The Austro-Hungarian army is on the verge of defeat, really, here in 1914. What the Germans do in response is they send troops down to help their allies in Austria-Hungary, and they plan an offensive here, right in the just south of the, or just north of the foothills here. So the Carpathians are, they're a very long but not terribly high mountain range in Europe. You get down to the foothills here in the town of Garlica and the town of Tarnów, and there's a gap between the Carpathians and the Vistula River here. And the Germans decide we're going to launch an offensive here because if we can break through, we can make all of these guys retreat. It's the kind of thing generals are planning all the time in World War I, and it rarely works out for them for reasons that I can talk about. There are actually good reasons why breakthroughs don't. Initial breakthroughs actually happen all the time in World War I. You may not know this. I mean, the story of World War I is, oh, they got out of no man's land, there were shells, there were machine guns, and no one ever made it to the other trenches. That isn't true. Guys make it to the other trench all the time. The problem is that when they make it to those trenches, they can't then develop that attack, and they get pushed back in a counterattack. So that's one of the things that accounts for all this bloodiness in these battles, both on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. So in early May 1915, when the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians launched this joint offensive on this narrow little platform here between Görlitz and Tarnów, they achieved one of the few great breakthroughs in the war. The Russians are unable to deploy reserves. They don't have enough shells to stop them, and you get this huge breakthrough by German forces that push all the way to the San River. And that does force a retreat basically before there's any combat here by forces to the south and to the north of them. They have to retreat from the Carpathians, give up on their invasion plans. A month later, they invade in the north as well, across the Narew River to try to take Warsaw. And this gets accomplished again in late July into early August of 1915. So what ends up happening over the course of the summer of 1915 is that Russia suffers the most significant military defeat in the war, really bar none. I mean, even the German defeat in 1918 isn't as substantial in terms of territory as what happens in Russia in 1915. So this is a massive defeat. This is the line here at the beginning, and this is the line here where they're forced to retreat to by the end of September 1915. What does this mean in practical terms? The Russian Empire loses most of what's today Ukraine, all of what is today Poland, parts of what are today Belarus and Lithuania, and Latvia, all the way up to the city gates of Riga. They lose their colonies in Eastern Europe, is what happens in the summer of 1915. And this is a huge political, moral, and military disaster. Among the many things that occur, that result from this, and this is the moment where the Russian Empire breaks, the summer of 1915. Among the many things that that occur is a massive unleashing of internal migration of refugees into the center of the country. The numbers are startling. You start to see deportations and forced migrations even before the Great Retreat, but we're seeing by the end of 1915, somewhere in the order of 3 to 4 million. By the end of the war, 6 million internally displaced people within the Russian Empire. That's a gigantic number of refugees that, and this is one of several really harrowing pictures that you can find from the time period of people fleeing these battle zones. Part of this is voluntary. People just want to get out before the German army comes in. And part of it is forced. The Russian army conducts a scorched earth campaign, forces people to leave, burns down their farms, kills all their cows, does the sorts of things that armies and scorched earth campaigns do. There were many, even at the top of the Tsarist political system, who thought that this might be the end in 1915, that the Tsarist government would collapse, that this would be the final blow for the Tsarist autocracy here in 1915. It had demonstrated the complete bankruptcy of the autocracy. It had shown how bad governance was. It had shown how terrible military command was. And in the midst of all of this, we get a state crisis, as you can imagine. There's a loss of faith in the government itself. This is a picture that dates to an earlier period. This is the crowds of people who gathered to cheer in 1914 at the declaration of war in Palace Square in St. Petersburg, which rapidly gets named Petrograd because Petersburg sounded too German to folks in the midst of the war. And this was sort of the visual representation of what Russians, like the French, called the sacred union. That is to say, we're going to leave politics to the side for the duration of the war. We're not going to carp on the Tsar anymore. We're not going to have partisan political battles. We're not going to have parties fighting each other. We're going to, if we're in the parliament, we're going to we're going to sort of close ourselves down, and we're going to let the government pursue the war. And that was the policy that was forwarded for the first year. With the big military defeat that I just talked about, this sacred union comes to an end, and it happens really quite rapidly in a number of ways. Let me mention just a couple of key events. One of them in early June, 1 week after the Austrians had retaken a fort that had gone back and forth on the Eastern Front, and sort of one of the big symbols of Russian defeat early in the campaign, again, late May, early June. There are riots that take place in Moscow. These are riots that are organized around anti-German sentiment. They start out with people looting stores that people think are German because they have German-sounding names. And this was supported by many right-wing nationalists within the empire, and by much official discourse as well. But the government didn't want to see rampaging crowds destroying shops and burning down buildings in the middle of Moscow in the middle of the war. And so this was taken to be a dangerous moment, ethnopolitics perhaps going over the edge. And this was an early indicator to the government that things might be going awry. More practically, what happens here is that the government, which had taken the stance that, well, we shouldn't shoot into crowds because we don't want to start a revolution like we did in 1905 by shooting into crowds. Let's let these protests develop and we're not going to crack down on them. They decide after the Moscow riots, no, we have to shoot into crowds. We have to put these down quickly and decisively. This is going to come back to bite them in February of 1917. The idea that you have to deal with protesters through the use of military force. Labor violence also explodes. There had been a sharp reduction in strikes in the first year of the war. In the summer of 1915, the government says, you shouldn't be striking. We're all fighting to defend the fatherland. You can't have any more labor unrest. And it's at this point, again, that labor activists, some of them, but not all of them, from the radical revolutionary parties, decide they're going to reinvigorate strike campaigns. And in the central industrialized region and in the city initially of Kostroma, we get strikes beginning on the 16th of June that are linked again to the defeats that are happening at the front. Here, too, the government uses force to put them down. But all the rumors of ammunition shortages is one of the reasons that this turns out to be so bloody, because the strikers, the police fire over their heads at first to warn them to stop rampaging. And when no one falls down, they say, they don't have any bullets, just like the guys at the front, so we could go rush them. Well, it turned out that they did have bullets, and again, you get this confrontation in Kostroma that leads to strikes all over central Russia. And so you start to see labor tension increasing. And then finally, you get a renewal of political opposition. It's only natural in these circumstances that people that had stood to the side for the previous year now say, we can't stand to the side anymore. The country's going to hell in a handbasket, and we need to do something to save it, even if the Tsar, even if we have to oppose the Tsar. And so leaders of so-called public organizations, the leaders of the main political parties, all get together to form what they call a progressive bloc, which is basically a loyal opposition. They say, we'll do anything you need to fight for the war effort, but you have to allow us to take part in it. You've bungled it in the first part. We're here to help. Don't repress us, but we're going to work together with you. And they get the support of conservatives on the state council. They get support of conservatives in the Duma. They get the support of all of Tsar Nicholas's own ministers except for one, but that one was the chairman of the Council of Ministers, and he went to the Tsar and said, you shouldn't listen to these people. You have to be a strong autocrat and rule basically dictatorially. The Tsar ignores the progressive bloc, disbands the Duma, and assumes control of the army himself. So this is, again, the moment when the political break as a result of the Great Retreat becomes most evident. Like I said, many people expect that this is the moment at which the empire is going to collapse, and it very well could have. But remarkably, over the course of 1916, there are a series of remobilizations that occur that begin to give some life again, really, to the Russian Empire in the last year before the revolution. The picture I have here is of General Alexei Brusilov, the most famous Russian general in the war because of a military campaign in Galicia that he leads, a successful one in 1916. But it's not just generals that are engaged in this sort of re-energizing of the Russian population. We get congresses of doctors, we get congresses of academics, we get all sorts of people who are looking for ways to help the war effort, even though their efforts at this large political progressive bloc have failed. All of these are in a progressive and technocratic mode. What do I mean by that? These are people that want to use science and social science to try to solve the problems that they see that the war has created, right? And there's a lot of ways in which these people have success, and they try to ease the, let's say, the burdens of wounded soldiers. Without these people, many more Russian wounded soldiers would have died. They create virtually all the hospitals, all the hospital trains. They bring all the doctors and the nurses and medicines. All of this is done by these social organizations that are bringing this together. But they also have an ethos of surveillance. One of the ways they try to deal with epidemic disease, for instance, is by quarantining people, by making sure that everyone on trains gets pulled off and checked for sickness, mass inoculation campaigns. There's a way in which you start to see the heavy hand of scientific experts making their way into Russian politics here in 1916. And most notably, this happens in terms of the organization of labor. There are vast labor deficiencies over the course of the war that became even more acute. And the solution from the part of the state and many social activists is that you should start to force labor. You should start to coerce labor. And the most notable moment of this is in 1916, when they decide they want to draft previously undrafted nomads in Central Asia, people that we would today call Kazakhs and Kyrgyz and some Uzbeks. This leads to a massive rebellion in Central Asia, in which they have to pull troops off the line in the Eastern Front to go launch this really violent, punitive expedition to put it down and to drive, again, hundreds of thousands of those people across the border into China. So we see the empire trying to refashion itself from the ground up in a certain way in 1916, at the same time that we see the Tsar undermining it himself with his own short-sighted policies from the top. Militarily, I mentioned Brusilov before and his success in Ukraine, but there are a series of other successful campaigns in 1916 as well. We should see the efforts of the Russian army over the course of World War I as decidedly a mixed bag. They have a number of successes to go with their famous failures. So they defeat the Ottoman Empire here and occupy much of eastern Anatolia, Erzurum, Trabzon, Van. All of these are Ottoman cities that they come to occupy. And they launch an initially successful campaign into Persia as well. This is with a single corps led by General Baratov that eventually tries to go and relieve British forces that have invaded what's today Iraq in an effort to knock out the Ottoman Empire as well. So the Middle Eastern campaigns of the Russian army are successful at the same time that some of their campaigns in Europe are as well. So it's a really interesting, roiling, very unstable situation that we see here in 1916, in which the state that the Tsar leads is collapsing, but this kind of proto-state that's being built by social actors from below is starting to form itself. Right? And the question is, which of these is going to happen first? Is the Tsar state going to collapse, or are we going to have this revitalization of a Russian state in the midst of the war that is going to save the war effort and perhaps Russian statehood itself? The answer is collapse. Again, we can see this as directly a result of loss of capacity by the state. The reason that the February Revolution breaks out, the first revolution of 1917, the one that undoes the monarchy, not the one that the Bolsheviks and the communists come to power later in the year, but the first revolution happens because of social mobilization from the ground up related to the privations of war and the inability of the Russian state to manage the economy. What's happening in Petrograd and many other Russian cities, and really many cities across Europe, is that food supplies are becoming scarcer and scarcer. Lines are becoming longer and longer. Hunger is becoming ever more apparent in these cities. And again, this is happening in Berlin, it's happening in Vienna, it's happening in Petrograd. Revolution comes first to Russia, where you have the people who are most affected by this social collapse, urban women, are the first to take up arms, basically, in order to protest what's happening. And so on International Women's Day, you get a series of marches across the city, led by working class women in the working class districts, by middle class women in the middle class districts of the city, protesting in the war and protesting the lack of food and the privations that they're being forced to endure. They are soon joined by many other strikers and from factories, male and female, and this provokes a crisis of government, which again, it won't surprise you to hear after everything I've said, the state is unable to manage. They can't even get troops there to put down the revolution in time, and indeed the Tsar himself is persuaded to abdicate by his own generals at the end of this process. And so in a remarkable and a remarkably short period of time, in February and March of 1917, the 300-year-old Russian dynasty comes to an end. This throws up in the air what the future of Russian statehood is going to look like. I'm not going to go into great detail about the number of different arrangements that are in place with different areas of the empire, but suffice it to say that Finland, for instance, understood its relationship to the Russian Empire to be a monarchical one, that they had sworn allegiance back in the 19th century to the Russian throne, and if the Russian Tsar abdicates, well, that game's over, we're independent now. And so there are disputes all over the course of 1917 about whether Finland is going to be part of the empire. Most notably, this crisis occurs in Ukraine, and Ukraine becomes the key place. It's the key battlefront. It's the key political place that the question of empire is being worked out in 1917, and it's the place where almost all of the most interesting things that happen in terms of the revolution in empire take place over the course of 1917. The provisional government finds it, which is led by liberals who think that they're good on questions of empire, but turn out to be pretty terrible on questions of empire. They are constantly saying arrogant and clueless things about things in the periphery. And so Ukrainian nationalists are getting more and more irked, and so too are Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian workers and Ukrainian peasants. By the end of 1917, we've gone from a situation in which most people in the empire are willing to stay together in Russia, in something called Russia, as long as they have a voice in it, to a situation in which independence movements have become basically successful. At the end of 1917, we have independence in Finland. In January and into February of 1918, Ukraine, the Ukrainian Rada declares independence, and we begin to see, again, the unraveling in formal terms of the Russian Empire. And again, this is all linked to the process of state collapse that's occurring over the course of 1917 and into early 1918. This collapse becomes most acute in the summer of 1918, and this is where I end the book. In August and September of 1918, with the loss of the city of Kazan by the Bolsheviks, at which point, as you can see from this map, which I borrowed from Bruce Lincoln's book on the Russian Civil War, Red Victory, the territory that's kind of inside these dotted lines is the territory that's controlled in August 1918 by the Red Army and by Bolshevik forces. It's more or less what Russia looked like back in the time before Ivan the Terrible took Kazan in the 1550s. So we have the complete unraveling of the Russian Empire and of Russian power. There's no more Ukraine, there's no more Baltics, there's no more Crimea, there's no more, in a certain sense, Siberia, much less Central Asia. The Russian Empire has completely collapsed by the end of August 1918. And again, that's where I end the core story of the book, because the book is about the collapse of empire and the end of empire. It's a remarkable story about how the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union then recreate that empire. In fact, a month later, led by Trotsky, the Red Army retakes Kazan. And then the beginning of the reacquisition of the empire comes about. And the fact that this happens so rapidly has led, I think, too many people to think that there was some sort of continuity there, that the empire had just been taken, that sort of, they had occupied these imperial offices and they just reoccupied the Russian Empire. It wasn't. It was a reconquest. It was a renegotiation. It was a set of political struggles and military struggles and state collapse and social failure all throughout the region of the Russian Empire. And that is a very interesting story, which would have made my book much too long, and certainly would have made my talk much too long as well. So let me just wrap up by talking about one final aspect of what emerges in the course of the war, which is the emergence of warlordism in Russia. And this, I think, is the final piece of evidence that what we have in Russia and Eastern Europe and Central Asia in this period is a process of decolonization, because we get the emergence of what we also see in Africa and Asia in decolonizing moments, which is the emergence of warlords. That is to say, military leaders who acquire power over particular regions, and they begin to exercise state-like functions. Often these are really terrible places to live because these people are extractive in terms of the economy. They're not providing great opportunities for people to live peaceful, productive lives. They tend to take stuff that they see. They're extremely violent, and they tend to be bad for not only for societies but for states in the future. And we see warlords emerge all over the former Russian Empire in the midst of the Russian Civil War, again in a similar way that we might see them in Somalia or in Congo or in other places that have also suffered through the period of decolonization. And the main reason is because of the lack of a powerful centralized state. And so the solution, one of the reasons, the key reason in my view, that Russia emerges from this imperial apocalypse with a new imperial state of its own is precisely that certain key figures, I have Pilsudski who does a similar thing in Poland, but in particular people like Trotsky, begin as warlords or they act as warlords in certain parts of the Russian Civil War, but in fact, they are more concerned with state building. This is a real irony for people that study Marxist thought, because these are supposed to be the people who are all about the withering away of the state. But Trotsky wasn't withering away anything in 1918 or 1919. He wanted to head the Commissariat of Heavy Industry. That's not something either of these guys wanted to do. These guys wanted to be military guys from the day they were 18 to the day they died, not Trotsky. And that's a big difference, and is one of the reasons that the Bolsheviks won, and it's certainly one of the reasons that they were able to rebuild an empire on the ruins of the old Tsarist Empire. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Your presentation is one of a rolling out of revelation upon revelation by a master narrator, storyteller.
Thank you.
Maps, I really
Yes.
Yes, is there any questions, follow-up?
Yes.
You mentioned it briefly in the beginning, but how much of the novel do you spend talking about the collapse of the Ottoman and Austrian Empire?
Yeah, so very little. Very little. I had dreams at one point of making this kind of a front zone book in which I looked at the interaction between these collapsing empires and the effect that it had on people's lives. It took me long enough to write this one. It would have taken me a lot longer to do it with in the Austrian case and the Ottoman case. And there the process is different in each of those. The closest analogy is going to be the Ottomans more than the Habsburg, or certainly more than the German Empire. The Ottomans do see, in many respects, some of the same processes and some of the same pathologies. I mean, if we think about the Armenian genocide in particular, this is clearly something that there was a potential for within the Russian Empire. I mean, we could have seen the moves towards ethnic cleansing of Germans and Jews turn into something much more murderous. It was already extremely destructive of lives and of people, but ethnic cleansing is something that's different from genocide. The Russians didn't tip over that line, and the Ottomans did. But you know, it was similar processes were happening, and for some of the same reasons. Other question?
Well, first of all, thank you. I can't remember the last time I took so many notes in a presentation, which I guess just means I have to buy the book. But I wanted to ask you one question. September 1915, you made a really provocative case that it could have all fallen apart then, but it doesn't. We have another 18 or so months to go. So what, in your opinion, what accounts for the temporary stability of the state?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting and important moment, and I actually side with most other historians about the reason for that temporary stability. And most of them and I do the same, use this very famous essay by the cadet Vasily Maklakov called A Tragic Situation. And this is published in one of the main Russian newspapers. And he tells a little tale in this story. And he says, imagine that you're driving along a mountain road with a crazy driver. And he's clearly dangerous, and he's endangering your life and the life of your mother, who's in the back seat. And your question is, do you try to take the wheel from that driver? Because if you take the wheel from the driver, maybe that struggle is going to send you over the cliff. But if you don't take the wheel from him, maybe his crazy driving is going to steer you over the cliff. And he says the whole time your mother, who's supposed to be representing the Russian nation, is berating you from the back seat, saying, why aren't you taking control? Why aren't you taking control? And Maklakov's answer in September 15 is, we can't take the wheel. In November of 1916, when the Duma comes back together, there are two incendiary. The first speech is actually by a Polish nationalist. The second speech, or another one of the early speeches, and it's about, because the Germans have just promised new autonomy for the Poles, and he wants to talk about the Russian Empire. The second or third speech in here is the famous stupidity or treason speech by Pavel Milyukov, another cadet, who says, who basically implies that that the Tsar's government is not just stupid, but that the Germans have infiltrated it and is being run by traitors. In the same session, Maklakov also stands up and gives an equally stirring speech that gets called the God and Mammon speech. And he says, there comes a time where you have to serve either God or Mammon. We can no longer serve. You have to make a choice now. And now we can no longer serve the Russian government. They've proven it. We have to take our own path. So by November of 1916, the moderates within the Russian government have decided that the Tsar's government has lost all of its authority, and they have to move towards revolution. Interestingly, Maklakov gets approached after his speech by a member of the extreme right wing, Prushkevich, who is plotting to kill Rasputin, who he blames for all of the problems. Right? So the far right has its own explanation for what's going on. And their explanation is Rasputin has just overtaken the royal family, and that's why they're doing all these stupid things. Right? It's not because they're just doing what they've done for decades. It's because of Rasputin. And Maklakov is invited to join the conspirators, and he says no, but he doesn't report this to anyone. He admits later on that he's guilty of conspiracy to murder, but obviously he's not going to get prosecuted. So it shows how deep the malaise had become by November 1916. But in September, they weren't willing to grab that wheel. So I think that's the basic. Stalin explains it in a different way. He said it was a revolt on their knees. In other words, they didn't have the political will or courage to launch a revolt the liberals, when they really needed to.
Me?
Yes.
there's so many topics and so many questions I could ask, but I'll start with staring at Trotsky here. A big missing character in your narrative is any kind of organized revolutionary group. Now, we know a lot of them until 1917 were away. Trotsky was in Brooklyn, or, you know, but the leaders anyway. If a traditional Soviet account of this period would have been very different. It would have given much more of a leading role to organized revolutionary, especially Leninist revolutionary groups. So, can you explain why they're missing?
Yeah, so they're missing from the talk. They're not missing from the book, but they enter the book in a different way than the traditional historiography has done. So my argument in the book, it is centered around empire and the end of empire, is that there is a genuine anti-imperial feeling that consolidates and becomes one of the real foundations of 1917 political thought, not just among politicians, but most importantly among soldiers. This gets expressed in the slogan that is popular all across the army and throughout most of the country: peace without annexations or indemnities. This is a long phrase that just basically says a very simple thing. We're not going to fight for the empire. We're willing to fight to make sure the Germans don't come occupy our hometowns. But we're not willing to fight for the Straits. We're not willing to fight to expand territory in Ukraine. We're not willing to fight to gain territory anywhere else in the world. That's what we're going to, and we believe as soldiers that that's what soldiers on the other side of the line want too, right? That the way we end this war is to renounce imperialism. This gets adopted quite early by socialists, primarily early on by Mensheviks from the borderland, really, Chkheidze in particular. And these people are the ones that actually articulate the notion of national self-determination, right? Before Wilson does, really. You know, this is where these notions of national self-determination and anti-imperial war really develop over the course of 1917. And they're the ones that put it on the international agenda. And it's the liberals, I mentioned sort of an aside, that the liberals sort of were bad in terms of empire, and this is where they're the worst. And Milyukov famously in April refuses to renounce imperial goals for the state and loses his job because of it. And really, in June, the cadets are going to do the same thing in Ukraine, and they're all going to lose as a result. The cadets impale themselves on imperial questions in 1917. Yes, no, they never get it. They actually never get it. And but the rest of the population had, and most importantly, so do the Bolsheviks, right? The Bolsheviks are known over the course of 1917 as the purest party of anti-imperialism in the Russian context. They're the ones that have consistently said, not just peace. Everybody has heard that Lenin's slogan for peace was there. Not just peace, but no more war for empire. And their purity on this question gains them support not just from workers, but from many, many others as well. I mean, there are testimonies from, remember, there are a lot of Polish refugees. I showed all those refugees that are living in central Russia here in 1917. The Bolsheviks are saying what they want to hear also. And so one of the ways that we explain the rise of Bolsheviks to power in 1917 is because of their, because they choose the right side of the imperial question. And the right side of that is end of empire. And again, that's not something we see because they rebuilt the empire after the war. But there's a lot of super interesting political stuff that's happening here that I didn't get a chance to go in. Proposals for federal systems and all kinds of, people are being very creative about how you rethink the Russian political space once you take away the monarch and once you take the idea of Russia for the Russians. But none of those come to fruition because of what I was just talking about. So they're not absent, and of course the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik seizure of power in October are enormously important. But they, in terms of my story, they finalize this process towards decolonization and ride that wave. Another question? Yes.
Thank you. The notion of Nicholas taking over the army, it sounds so counter to his character. Did the Tsarina challenge his manhood or something?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is kind of a complicated story. So the commander-in-chief, most people thought he was going to assume commander-in-chief role at the very beginning of the war. He was persuaded not to because if military defeats happen, then perhaps he's going to bear some blame for that, but also because his relative, the Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, I think it's the son of his great uncle, another Romanov, is actually a member of the royal family that has significant military experience and prestige within the military, and he chooses him to be the commander-in-chief instead. The first year of the war, especially in summer of 1915, it means he doesn't have to be fired, but he should be fired. I mean, that's what happens to generals when these things happen. And the question of who you're going to replace him with if you're going to fire him, and if you're going to say, I'm going to reject all participation from other people within society, he becomes almost the only obvious choice. He either has to leave Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich there to run it even after all these defeats, or he's got to take control. There were plenty of people that told him he shouldn't do it, because actually the Grand Duke remained politically popular for a number of reasons, but he chose not to. I think in a certain way, that his assumption of power has far less to do with what happens than has traditionally been stated in the literature, because I mean it certainly leads to chaos among the ministers over the course of 1916, but that chaos among ministers has less and less to do with what's happening with the country. Like sometimes governments have more or less to do with what's happening in a country than other times, and they have separated themselves in a certain way from the running of the country over the course of 1916. Other questions? These can be simple questions too. I know many of you haven't gotten to World War I in your class yet, so if something was unclear, you can definitely ask. Any question that you have? No? Well, terrific. Well, thank you very much. All right.